Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University for welcoming me. That is such a privilege, and I want to thank also all the people who make my stay so pleasant, the New York University staff, the faculty members, and the students who have been very dedicated. Tonight, I am going to talk about photography. Photography has always been a source of wonder for me. I started developing my own photographs when I was 14 years old, and I became fascinated by these images that are so easy to produce. Creation was for me a kind of alchemy. That motivated my interest in science and led me to get a master's degree in chemistry and later on a PhD in conservation science. The production of these poeta images that are not provided through a pictorial skill makes them familiar and intelligible to all. And if we look around us, photographs are part of our daily life. There is not a day, I would say even not an hour, where we are not confronted with photographic images. However, as much as Van Eyck's paintings, if we look closely at them and penetrate the image, the photographs raise as many questions as they give us information. For this presentation, I have adopted the title of an exhibition and a wonderful catalogue composed by my colleague and mentor, the photo historian Michel Frisot. Every photograph is an enigma. Michel started collecting vernacular photographs very early on, and he gathered an amazing collection. Those photographs were found in shoeboxes, in dumpster during a house clearance, or on the stall of junk dealers, all those anonymous stack of images, too often disdained, which often hold treasures. And with the transition to digital technology, these analog photographs, products of mass consumption, whose number will not diminish, these anonymous photographs are today experiencing a revival of interest. More than ever, they challenge us and question us. To quote Marcel Proust in his literary masterpiece In Search of Lost Time, à la recherche du temps perdu, a photograph may be seen as a thickness of art. I want to express here the fact that a photograph can have different layers of meanings and information, and these are not always accessible to viewers. The French singer Barbara tells us in a magnificent song called Rouault, things have their secrets, things have their legends, but things speak to us if we know how to hear. Here is a mission for heritage community, curator, conservators, art historians, scientists, stakeholders, to be mediators, conveyors of meaning, and to contribute to preserving and exhibiting heritage objects so that they continue to deliver their messages to present and future generations. Yes, every object is a bearer of meaning. It informs and raises questions about memory, about changes, about societal transformations, about relationships with our loved ones, but also about its own materiality, its mode of production, its alteration over time. And to illustrate this, and in order to organize my lecture tonight, I have selected 5 images that have punctuated my professional career. I wish to leave the veil on a part of their mystery, whether it concerns the technical history, material sciences, human sciences, or even the simple things of life. I selected this image as a preamble because it evokes a person who is dear to me and to whom I owe my presence here today. It's a portrait of Françoise Flieder. Françoise Flieder was my director. She founded the Research Center for the Conservation of Graphic Documents in Paris, which I directed after her for more than 20 years. In November 1990, during the months of photography in Paris, I discovered an exhibition of a young photographer, Arthur Gerbeau. Arthur took photographs of shopkeepers in a very lively street in the center of Paris, the Rue Montorgueil. And this exhibition was also presented at the Alliance Française here in New York in June, July 1990. I was very touched by the poetry and the humor that emanated from these images. I contacted this photographer and asked if he would be interested in making pictures of scientists in their laboratory at the Museum of Natural History. Arthur liked the idea, and so did my director, Françoise Flieder. Arthur came to the museum and took a series of photographs which are still hanging 30 years later on the walls of our laboratory. Colleagues were initially a little reluctant, but quickly they started to pose in a great complicity with the photographer. And you probably won't recognize me while illustrating the impermanence of digital photographs by threatening to make my own image disappear with a simple click. At the time, a sarcastic movie, Tati Daniel, the story of a rather nasty old lady, was being released in movie theater. And the movie poster indicated that she never met you, but she already hates you. And to my great surprise, my director, Françoise Flieder, who usually preferred to pose in a solemn, dominating attitude, improvised to pose as Tati Daniel. And the result was this funny picture in the context of the time, an unexpected portrait for those who knew her. So, of course, maliciously, I hurried to hang this portrait at the entrance of the laboratory. I thought it would be a kind of door god. In Asia, door gods are scary and threatening guardians that are placed at the entrance of temples. They are in charge of repelling bad spells and keeping away evil spirits. I have to tell you that bad spells have tormented Françoise when she was young. During the war, Françoise was a teenager and she had to flee Paris to escape the roundup of Jewish family and take refuge in various farms in the south of France during the German occupation. Other colleagues were to suffer the torments of deportation, such as Julien Quin, director of the National Library, or the Greek botanist Roger Haim, who held a mycology chair at our Museum of Natural History. At the end of the war, in 1945, Françoise Flieder returned to Paris and began training as laboratory technician. Julien Quin and Roger Haim, survivors of Buchenwald, returned to their positions, Julien Quin as the head of the National Library in Paris and Roger Haim to the Museum of Natural History. During those troubled years in Paris, the library's storage had been neglected and the room had become colonized by fungus. Julien Quin contacted Roger Haim, his fellow prisoner, and Roger Haim, the great mold specialist, hired Françoise Flieder to work on the treatment of books contaminated by microorganisms. This is how, from so much misfortune, the Research Center for the Conservation of Graphic Documents was born at the National Museum of Natural History. It was a rather complicated name, and in 2004 I simplified the name to CRC, the Research Center for Conservation. In the 1950s, in a very masculine world, it took persuasion and willpower for a single woman to build from scratch on her own the first research laboratory in France devoted to the preservation of cultural heritage. Françoise was a woman of conviction, and her troubled childhood had forged a strong character in her. I was fortunate that she hired me in 1983 to work on the preservation of photographs. It was an interesting time when photographs were beginning to be considered an important part of our national heritage. And today I am happy to see the international emulation in this field, which makes photography a research field in its own right. And I am grateful to Françoise Flieder for introducing me to it 40 years ago. That is why I wanted to tell the story of this odd portrait, the story of this unexpected pose for a director of an institution, a respectable lady, Madame Flieder, in order to pay her a tribute. She left us discreetly 5 years ago. Over the years, our research center has gradually opened up to other types of cultural good, in particular natural history collections, which makes sense since the lab is located in the heart of historical and scientific collection that number over 68 million specimens. This venerable Parisian institution holds unsuspected treasures. The almost archaeological explorations of the closets, drawers, or attics of the Museum of Natural History sometimes led to the unearthing of documents that are precious for the history of science and cultural heritage. In particular, what interests us today, photographs. Being at the center of scientific study in the 19th century, it was normal for this institution to possess photographic treasures. Although the lack of interest in this heritage and the tribulation of the archives caused us to lose many documents. Around the year 2000, my colleague Christine Barth, in her survey mission, discovered an unexpected series of photographs, and she immediately contacted me. When I saw these images, I knew what it was and what I was looking at. I think I just briefly said, those are color photographs by Becquerel. This short statement did not reflect my excitement to discover those images. Such a small rainbow frozen on a metal plate might be insignificant for most people, but it is a milestone in the technical history of photography. This is the earliest color photograph produced in 1848. The origin of colors remained a source of mystery and debate for over 100 years. And then, a couple of years ago, we decided to study those plates and this photographic process in details. But let me give you an explanation first about the context. We are here in 1839 in Paris at the Academy of Sciences, and its talented secretary, François Arago, has learned of Daguerre's invention, the daguerreotype. The unmistakable quality and precision of the image provided by this new photographic process excite Arago. Because with the daguerreotype, Arago has a tool that will not only serve to document the world, but will be useful for science and scientists. Of course, the scientists of the Academy of Sciences were in the front row to study this mind-blowing photographic process. However, those early images had no color. For Arago, this problem will be resolved on the day a substance that records the color of light will be discovered. This declaration led researchers to seek a chameleon substance capable of recording directly and representing all the color. Among them, a young scientist, Edmond Becquerel, is involved in this research. He's only 19 years old, but his father, César Becquerel, member of the Science Academy, had already recruited him as his personal assistant in his physics laboratory at the Museum of Natural History. Of course, even at this time, it was considered a bit odd that a father would recruit his son. César Becquerel's answers to this criticism was straightforward. He said, "I did not recruit my son. I recruited the best candidate, and it happened to be my son." This became almost a family tradition, as the Museum of Natural History welcomed 4 generations of Becquerels, one of whom, Henry, received the Nobel Prize for Physics. But let's go back to Edmond Becquerel. He is highly productive. In addition to discovering what would later be known as a photovoltaic effect, he quantitatively evaluated the impact of each color of light on a daguerreotype plate. The daguerreotype and other early photographic processes were sensitive to ultraviolet and blue light, but anything red, orange, or green in the subject being photographed would appear in the final image in a dark shade. Thus, it was difficult to capture both the sky with its clouds and the landscape with its modulations in the same shoot. But to photograph the landscape with trees and greenery, a relatively long exposure time was needed, and the sky would be overexposed, so it appeared uniformly whitish in the photographic print. On the other hand, to take a picture of the clouds in the sky, the exposure time had to be very short, but no details of the landscape were then recorded by the photographic layer. To get around this difficulty, photographers like Gustave Le Gray in the 19th century took 2 photographs, one of the sky and one of the landscape. Then they combined the 2 negatives to form a positive image where the clouds and the landscape were well represented. Sometimes the same clouds image were used in different prints. This color blindness of light-sensitive materials was also an issue for portraits. Photographic treatises from the 1870s warned photographers to spray white powder on blonde hairs, or it will appear black in the final print. I recently experienced this to my cost, of course, not for my hair. During my last visit to New York, in 2019, Geoffrey Berliner welcomed me at the amazing Penumbra Foundation, which promotes all photographic processes, nowadays called alternative processes. Geoffrey invited me to pose for a tintype, a photographic process popular in the second half of the 19th century. Things seemed to be going well. The image was timidly revealed, and I saw myself in a posture as flattering as that of Hemingway by Yusuf Kosh. But in fact, I was inheriting my portrait as Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's novella. My face appeared with dark spots on my temple and around my eyes, and the top of my head was studded with spots. The photograph has dramatically intensified the marks of time. Any freckles or reddish area was translated into a dark or even black zone. Of course, this lack of chromatic sensitivity in the portrait only affects my ego, but there might be more tangible impacts for cultural heritage, particularly in terms of documentation and conservation. You remember the tragic fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in April 2019. Fortunately, the 16 monumental copper statues, 11 feet high, that adorn the roof had been dismantled a few weeks before the fires and were miraculously saved. They were restored and are presented to the public at the Museum of French Monuments. When they were removed from the roof, as you saw on the pictures, they had a green patina. During the restoration, they were given a dark brown patina. So I asked the curators the decision to choose this patina had been arrived at. She showed me photographs of Marville taken in the 1860s, where these statues appeared very dark. It was this dark shade that had guided them in choosing the patina. Obviously, the argument was fallacious because whether the statue were green, orange, red, brown, or black, they were necessarily rendered in the photographs of the time with the same dark tone. The issue can be more delicate if we rely on 19th century photographs to assess the condition of ancient paintings. Edmond Becquerel was among the first to assess quantitatively the impact of each color of light on the daguerreotype on the silver iodide. These researches led him in 1848 to introduce a color photographic process that was surprisingly simple. A silver plate is immersed in a solution of chlorides to produce a layer of silver chloride on the surface. And when exposed to red light, this silver chloride layer turns pink. When exposed to a blue light, it turns blue. Under a green light, it turns green, and so on. Becquerel exposed such a plate to the solar spectrum, and color could record directly without any processing. A colored image of the spectrum was formed. A kind of instant image, actually not that instant, because the exposure could last more than 1 hour. Those images can be kept for more than a century in the dark, but they fade in the light. And for me, after 170 years, it was unexpected to find those fragile images in relatively good condition. This discovery reactivates an old question about this amazing color photographic process. Where did the color come from? During the 19th century, some physicists suggested that the colors were due to a light interference phenomenon. For other scientists, the color might be due to the formation of pigments. Our doctoral students explored this question in detail a few years ago. The difficulty in analyzing those plates using spectroscopic or imaging techniques is that the plates are still very sensitive to visible light, UV or X-ray, as well as to electron beams, which can lead to changes in the structure or composition of the color image during analysis. We can succeed in avoiding those interactions by working at low temperature with a limited dose of photon. The morphology of the image material was characterized by electron microscopy combined with electron and X-ray spectroscopy. We could not see any periodic structure of the material that would indicate an interferential phenomenon. Now we were able to identify different oxidation states that could explain the difference of colors. On the other hand, statistical study of the silver nanoparticles shapes present on the silver chloride deposit reveals that exposure to various colored lights causes a phenomenon of photoadaptation of those silver nanoparticles. we observed significant differences in the number of nanoparticles, their location, and their distributions of size and shapes depending on color. For example, a blue area has a large number of small nanoparticles, below 30 nanometers, embedded in the silver chloride grain. The size and distribution of these nanoparticles is the origin of color. This is known as a plasmonic effect. So for each type of nanoparticle, it was possible to study the diversity of plasmonic resonance modes that cover a large part of the visible range. This early color photographic process was not adopted by the photographers of the time, but it had an impact on technological choices and delay for more than 50 years the adoption of color photography as we know it today. Louis Ducos-Duron and Charles Cros, two brilliant personalities of the 19th century, proposed in the 1860s color photographic processes based on the use of only 3 primary colors. Such a principle was rejected by French physicists, and in particular by Edmond Becquerel. He stated that the color of these photographs were from the imagination and inaccurate. In short, he accused Louis Ducos-Duron of inpainting, doing colorization. Indeed, in the continuity of the Becquerel color photographic process, the physicists of the time considered that a true color photographic process had to capture and render directly the wavelengths of the subject at any point of the image, what we know today as hyperspectral imaging. This was a mistake. I mean, the work of Young, Maxwell, and then Helmholtz in 1867 in the field of physiological optics showed that any color can be reproduced in the eye of the observer by a mixture of only 3 primary colors. Finally, at the end of the 19th century, the photographic industry adopted this principle of color photographs using only 3 primary colors, as Ducos-Duron suggested. The first popular color photographic process consisted of creating color slide with colored blue, red, and green dots. This principle is very widespread nowadays, either for a computer or mobile phone screens. It was a simple idea, but at the time its implementation required the manufacture of an extremely fine colored screen. The American James McDonough and the Irishman John Joly drew colored line on a glass plate. In France, Louis Lumière used potato starch grains of about 12 micrometers that he dyed blue, red, or green. I mean, these grains were mixed and glued with a sticky varnish to a glass plate. The random distribution of colored grains gave a pointillist touch to the photographs and made this process successful, in particular at a time when pictorialist photography was still popular. This color plate was marketed in 1907 under the name Autochrome, and it was enthusiastically adopted by the photographic community and lasted until the 1930s. Near Paris, the Albert Kahn Museum holds more than 70,000 autochromes plates. Those so-called archives of the planet were gathered by the banker Albert Kahn during the first half of the 20th century. In order to better preserve this extraordinary collection, my colleague Jean-Paul Gandolfo, who at that time was photographer at the Albert Kahn Museum, and I I've devoted several years to the study of these plates, their stability and their manufacture. Among all the many questions we had, one was, why use potato starch? The potato starch grains have sizes ranging from 2 to 100 micrometers, and it is therefore necessary to carry out very complex sorting operation in order to extract the smallest grain, which represent a small percentage. Why not use rice starch that is much finer and more regular? Our investigation began in the potatoes field in the mountains near the city of Lyon. In the 1990s, we met Mr. Jean Demure, the son of the autochrome starch producer. He was 90 years old, but still remembered the details of the story. His father set up a starch factory in 1903 in the little village of Juré to meet Louis Lumiere's needs for a specific starch grain size that would be suitable for manufacturing autochrome plates. Here is Jean Demure, when he was 10 years old, on a bench with his relatives, depicted on an autochrome plate made with the starch grains his father delivered to the Lumiere factory. Those starch grains were extracted and sorted by settling in water in large basins that are still there. Our conversation with Mr. Demure and the archives confirmed that Louis Lumiere had considered all kinds of plants from all over the world that yielded starch, including rice starch. And actually, our tests indicate that rice starch does not properly absorb the dyes in comparison with potato starch. Then we analyze the dyes of autochrome plates from different periods. Liquid chromatography revealed that each color of grains was obtained with a mixture of 2 or 3 dyes or synthetics, some of which were from the triphenylmethane family, known for their instability to light. That was quite strange because we could not find much warning about autochrome fading, and the common thought was that autochrome was much more stable to light than color photographs produced after the 1950s. We recreated an autochrome plate and colored screen with different starch grain of the same color, and then subjected them to light aging. The results surprised us. We noticed that our blue starch grain were quite unstable to light. Then we decided to check if original autochrome plates behave in the same way. In the conservation field, to study the light fastness of museum objects, we apply the micro-fading test, introduced by Paul Whitmore. A microspot of the object is exposed to a strong light to assess the speed of fading. However, the original device is not suitable for measuring a small surface such as 10 to 20 micrometers and to measure by transparency. So we adopted the microfading test to a microscope, and thanks to an optical device, we were able to evaluate the light stability of each color of grains or group of grains of the same color. Again, the blue grains were very light sensitive on any plate tested. And actually, looking closely under the microscope at old autochromes from the Albert Kahn collection, which were projected to the public with quite powerful projectors, we noticed that the use of those blue starch grains would go from blue to violet to almost white, thus revealing the fading of the blue grain in some plates. But what is quite remarkable about autochromes is that even when the blue starch is very faded, the alteration may not be noticeable without reference. As you can see from this test, where the plate was exposed to light with partial protection, the blue starch has faded, the color has shifted, but without reference, it looks acceptable. Just because an object seems to us in good condition does not mean that it has not already been significantly modified. That's the whole point today of documenting works of art with spectrophotometrics measurements. Subsequently, museums have been very cautious about exhibiting autochromes. And in 2011, to exhibit Stiglitz and Steichen autochromes, an interesting pioneer project was led by Luisa Casella and Nora Kennedy at the Metropolitan Museum. The precious autochromes were exhibited framed under a very low level of oxygen in order to slow down light fading of the dyes. The discoloration of the starch grain from blue to violet to white, depending on the light exposure or the light dose in autochromes, gave me an idea to create a light dosimeter whose hue would change with the level of light exposure. By mixing two dyes with different light sensitivity, I reproduce what we had observed in the starch grain, a shift from blue to violet to white. And once calibrated, the change of color allows to monitor the cumulative light dose that an object got. This was patented, and thanks to my colleague Hannelore Römich, we were able to do field tests in different institutions. It was brought to the market under the name of LightCheck Hue. Unfortunately, the production was discontinued. That is unfortunate since we need to monitor the exposure of sensitive objects, those having dyes such as color photographs, but also all kinds of artifacts, including black and white photographs. In the early 1990s, I mentioned at the AIC Photographic Material Group meeting a curious phenomenon with some black and white photographs. And during an exhibition, some recently printed photographs turned yellow or pink. Actually, not the whole image, but certain low-density areas shift in a way not previously observed for black and white photographic print. And this was obviously the result of an interaction with light, since the area protected by the window mat remained unchanged. Why should such prints suddenly become so light sensitive compared to oldest ones? The gallery complained that the printer had not properly processed the photographs, and I checked the quality of the processing according to international standards. All those photographs had been perfectly processed, and the analysis matched the ISO recommendation for archival photographic prints. In the following years, this phenomenon became more and more frequent in photographic exhibition, leading to bitter discussions and even negotiation between the parties involved. And the manufacturers of the photographic papers did not provide any explanation, but advocated the use of a sulfocyanide stabilizing treatment. Poor air quality, ozone, inappropriate framing materials, and low silver content in newer photographic papers were blamed without a clear explanation as to why those photographic papers were more sensitive than the previous ones. Those photographic images are made up of fine silver deposits that are susceptible to oxidation by pollutants that accumulate in a confined space, in a box, in an album, or a frame. These accidents stress the issue of air quality in storage facilities and in photographic enclosures. I have been working with my colleague Christian Serre on metal organic frameworks, or MOFs, as a very efficient and selective adsorbent for indoor air pollutants. They are synthesized in laboratory by assembling an organic molecules and a metal ion, such as zirconium, aluminum, iron, copper, etc. And we have tested various MOFs which open excellent perspectives improving indoor air quality. However, those MOFs are synthesized in powder form. We therefore had to shape them in a form that could be more easily used in museums or archives by incorporating them in paper sheets. The first attempts to produce those sheets were made with the help of conservators at the French National Archives. We succeeded in preparing sheets containing up to 75% MOF. These MOFs can be used to trap in a very effective way all sorts of deleterious organic compounds to protect fragile objects, such as black and white photographs. However, the fragility of analog photographs at the end of the 20th century contributed to accelerate the adoption of digital prints by artists and photographers. Digital print. It is a popular term that never really convinced me, because a print is not a digital artifact, and a digital artifact by its very nature cannot be a print. I see in this oxymoron all the ambiguity of the nature of photographs today. It expresses its duality, both a tangible and intangible object. How can we better name the different types of photographic image today? What is the appropriate vocabulary for each type of image? Despite several attempts at the end of the 19th century and during the 20th century, the search for an appropriate common vocabulary, a photographic taxonomy, has run out of steam, and no consensus seems to have emerged to date. There remain an abundance of terms and names, sources of ambiguity, that technological developments are constantly increasing. The same type of photographs can be named in a different way. For instance, gelatin silver print, silver bromide print, silver bromide photograph, gelatin silver on barita paper, etc. Sometimes the terms used are confusing, such as inkjet on silver rack paper for Helmut Newton's photograph exhibited at the Grand Palais in Paris in 2012. There is still a need for the field to set and use a robust methodology that allows photographs to be named and classified in an unambiguous way. In conclusion, I would like to tell you a story that is a bit sad, but that reminds us of the remembrance value as well as the suggestive power of the photographic image. In 1989, I was assessing the alterations that silver particles undergo in gelatin printing out photographs. We observed the shape of silver deposit during aging with a transmission electron microscope. And at some point, it was necessary to digitize the transmission electron microscope photographs with a digital camera, and then perform image processing to quantify changes in the silver particles. Aging those photographic images in a humid environment rounds up the silver particles like pebbles in the stream. They become rounder, merge, and the visual characteristics of the image are modified. The equipment used for this study was not common as it is today. In the 1980s, digital cameras were something new. We had interns who were puzzled, so I made their portraits using this camera. This is a portrait of Ismail, one of our interns. I gave him this photo printed on a Xerox printer. We did not have a better quick way to print a picture. The following week, I learned that Ismail had committed suicide, thrown himself out of the window. That was terrible, a shock for everyone, and I started a memorial wreath that consisted in posting inside my closet door photographs of my colleagues and friends who had passed away, so that each time I opened the door, I thought of them. And the image of Ismail has stayed with me for more than 20 years, from office to the closet in my director's office. Nevertheless, the memory of this sad story gradually began to fade. In the early 2010s, the artist Dov Alush came to discuss early photographic processes. And as he wanted to see samples of autochrome plates, I opened my closet wide and handed him a plate. His face suddenly whimpered. His attitude froze. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, on the cabinet door, from which he did not detach his glance. After a long silence, he told me that he had been working with this image on his desk for 20 years. Ismail was his best friend, and Ismail gave him the picture days before he committed suicide. Dov had no idea in what context this image was produced, and suddenly, by pure chance, a link was made across time and space. That's how, after so many years, this simple image had the power to revive a part of the past and create a new friendship. It delivered to each of us pieces of a puzzle of which we had been ignorant. I have thought of this series of photographs as a narrative, that is to say, as a network capable of forming sets of meanings whose functioning and induced effects can be described. To quote Fabio La Rocca, photography is a mode of expression, communication, demonstration, and display. I am sorry if this presentation may be a bit too personal, but Michel Frisot rightly wrote that the element of enigma in photography bears witness, in fact, to what is to be human. Thank you for your attention.